The scar ran from her left temple to the hinge of her jaw, a raised white seam that caught the cool overhead lighting of the Galactic Medical Review Chamber and turned it into something geological, like a fault line pressed into skin. Assessor Vren Okelas of the Solvati Health Compliance Directorate had reviewed 11,000 physical inspection reports in his career. He had reviewed the intake files of Terran military personnel before, 4 of them, and each time the forms had struck him as quaint in their specificity, their detailed accounting of past injuries treated as biographical detail rather than institutional liability. He had not, however, reviewed one while the subject was present, and the scar in question was so visible, so unambiguous, that 2 of his junior compliance officers were failing to keep their reaction off their faces. Assessor Pelk, who was Kaldrathi and therefore communicated discomfort through a rapid cycling of his dorsal chromatophores, had gone from his standard administrative gray to something approaching amber. Assessor Tola, who was young and Raxian and had never completed a field evaluation before, had simply stopped writing. The human woman, Sergeant First Class Nadia Vasquez, sat across the examination table with her hands loose in her lap and her gaze directed at a point slightly above Vren's second set of eyes, which was technically correct posture for a species without secondary vision, and yet somehow managed to feel like she was looking past him entirely. The scar did not appear to trouble her. The 2 junior officers and their trouble appeared to trouble her even less. Vren cleared his throat, which in standard Solvati physiology was an entirely involuntary acoustic reflex, and was annoyed to find himself doing it voluntarily. "For the record," he said, "this review is a standard galactic health compliance audit of active duty personnel assigned Combat Advisory, Post 7, Terran Station. Sergeant." He placed the designation carefully. "The scarring across the left lateral cranial region. Your intake file notes it as a legacy wound, combat acquired, fully treated. Can you walk us through the circumstances?" Nadia Vasquez looked at him then, directly, in the way humans had of redirecting their gaze without any preliminary drift. One moment she was looking past him. The next, she was looking at him. It was, Vren had noted in his brief time dealing with Terran military personnel, a quality that the Kaldrathi Behavioral Index would have classified as predatory ocular locking, except that humans apparently did it in ordinary conversation with no awareness that it registered as a threat posture at all. "I can," she said. "What would you like to know?" The junior officers exchanged a glance that Vren declined to acknowledge. He consulted his datapad, though he had already read the file twice. "The wound is documented as sustained during the Battle of Keller's Rock, 18 standard months ago. The attending surgeon's report describes, and I quote, catastrophic lateral craniofacial trauma with secondary involvement of the left temporal lobe." He set the pad down. The attending surgeon also notes that the prognosis on admission was listed as non-survivable. The compliance chamber was small and smelled of the recycled atmospheric mix that Terran Station used throughout its administrative wing. Faintly mineral, faintly antiseptic, with a low undertone of something organic that Vren had never been able to identify. It had adjustable seating, which was a courtesy to the various species who used the facility, and the human had adjusted hers not at all. She sat in the Solvathi default configuration, a position that would have required a Solvathi subject to adopt an uncomfortable forward lean to match the table height. She had simply matched it without adjustment, which meant she was sitting precisely upright, her spine arranged in a way that Vren's secondary neural ganglion, the one that handled territorial threat calibration, was filing as a posture of deliberate claim. She occupied the chair the way a structure occupies the ground it is built on, Non-survivable, she said. The word neither a question nor a challenge, just a repetition. That's what they wrote. That is what the attending physician wrote, Vren confirmed. And yet, here you are. The thing that appeared on her face then was not quite a smile. It was closer to the expression a navigator makes when a route calculation confirms a course they had already decided to take. Here I am, she said. Pelk had gone fully amber. Tola had started writing again, Vren noticed, though he was fairly certain she was not writing anything related to the audit. The file on Nadia Vasquez was 47 pages long. Vren had flagged it for a formal review, not because of any single entry, but because of the cumulative pattern that had emerged when he applied the Solvathi statistical anomaly threshold to her deployment record. The threshold was designed to identify equipment failures and procedural breakdowns in galactic military units. It was not, to Vren's knowledge, designed to identify individual soldiers. The algorithm had never before returned a flag on a single biological entity. It had returned one on her. He had rerun the calculation 3 times, and the 3rd time he had called his supervisor, who had reviewed the output and said, very quietly, that Vren should proceed with the physical audit. When Vren had asked his supervisor whether she wanted to attend the review personally, his supervisor had said she had a prior commitment, which Vren had understood to mean that his supervisor had read the file more carefully than he had. He had then spent the following morning reading it again himself, more carefully, page by page, cross-referencing deployment dates against engagement logs and casualty reports until the pattern was not just a statistical output on a screen, but something he could trace in sequence, engagement by engagement, the same shape repeated across 7 different postings. He had set the file down after the 4th deployment and gone to get water from the dispensary unit in the corridor, and while he stood there, he had thought about the attending physician who had written non-survivable in the medical report on day 9, and about what it would mean to write that word and then, 18 hours later, revise it. He had thought about what kind of organism prompted that revision. Then, he had gone back to his office and read the last 3 deployments. You were at Keller's Rock for the duration of the engagement, Vren said. He was reading from the file now, not from memory. Reading from the file gave him something to look at that was not her face. 14 standard days. The Scraith incursion force was estimated on day 1 at approximately 900 combat-capable units. The garrison defending the civilian processing facility numbered at that point 42. 43, Nadia said. Vren looked up. The record indicates 42. Corporal Reyes had been listed as non-combat effective on day 1 due to a plasma burn on her primary weapon hand. She was not non-combat effective. She was annoyed. Nadia paused. She preferred to be counted. Tala had definitely stopped writing about the audit. Vren returned to the file. The arithmetic of Keller's Rock was not disputed. The Scraith incursion had begun with 911 confirmed combat units, a figure drawn from sensor sweeps on day 1 that all 3 participating galactic observer stations had independently verified. The civilian processing facility had held approximately 4,000 non-combatant refugees from the Terran system's 3rd colony, species distribution across 11 galactic races, none of them with military designations. The Terran Combat Advisory Unit had been stationed there, not because anyone had anticipated significant engagement. The Scraith rarely probed that far into the inner systems, but because the humans had requested the posting, and the Galactic Advisory Council had approved it, largely because the Keller's Rock posting was considered a moderately prestigious sinecure, quiet enough to generate goodwill with the Terran military contingent without requiring the deployment of any species whose own command structure would object to the risk level. The risk level had not stayed moderate. At the conclusion of the 14-day engagement, Vren said, the recorded Scraith combat casualties were 903. The civilian facility reported 0 casualties among the non-combatant population. The Terran unit's final strength was, he paused, 31. The number sat in the recycled air of the compliance chamber. Outside, in the corridor, the station's ventilation system produced a low, steady hum that Vren had stopped noticing 2 years ago and was now noticing again. Pelk's chromatophores had cycled all the way into a pale gold that Vren had only seen the younger assessor produce once before, when a structural integrity alarm had triggered in the east wing. Tala had put down her stylus. 12 of ours didn't make it out, Nadia said. She said it in the same even register she had used for everything else. Not flat, precisely. Measured, like a report being delivered, by someone who had given this particular report enough times that the words had found their natural weight and settled there. Good people. Corporal Reyes made it. She'd want you to know that. Yes, Vren said. He was not sure what else to say. His career had prepared him to assess compliance failures and procedural irregularities, to apply the health and welfare standards of the Galactic Compact to military and civilian personnel alike, to note discrepancies between file documentation and observed physical condition. His career had not prepared him for the arithmetic he was looking at, and he had the uneasy awareness that his supervisor's prior commitment was going to turn out to be a diplomatic fiction, that the actual prior commitment was the simple human desire to not be in this room watching the numbers settle into the air while the woman who produced them waited patiently for the next question. The scar, he said, which was not the question he had intended to ask. He had intended to ask about operational protocol, about the decision matrix that had led a 43-person unit to engage rather than evacuate. The scar was already in the file. The scar was not in question. The scar came out of his mouth anyway. The scar, she repeated, my junior officers. Vren gestured without looking at Pelk and Tola. There was a reaction. I want to note for the record that the Solvati Health Compliance Directorate does not sanction responses to physical characteristics that fall outside standard species variation parameters. Nadia Vasquez looked at Pelk and Tola with an expression that Vren, consulting his secondary neural response, would have characterized as patient tolerance. Pelk had gone to a mortified gray. Tola looked like she was trying to arrange her face into something professionally neutral and was 2 full cycles behind. I know what they were doing, Nadia said. They weren't being cruel. They've just never seen one before. One, Vren said. A scar from a Scraith claw strike, she said. It's distinctive. The plasma burns from their ranged units heal clean. The claw strikes. She touched the seam along her jaw with 2 fingers, lightly, the way a person touches a familiar object in the dark to confirm its location. They don't. The Scraith, in Vren's professional experience, were a species whose engagement in galactic affairs had never produced anything that could be categorized under health compliance review. They were categorized under the Galactic Compact's security appendix, under threat taxonomy, under the set of entries that Vren's directorate technically had jurisdiction over and practically never touched, because the entities that dealt with Scraith incursions were not the kinds of entities that filed health compliance reports. They filed after-action reports. They filed casualty manifests. They did not, in Vren's experience, sit in compliance chairs with their hands loose in their laps and use the present tense when discussing the taxonomy of Scraith wound patterns. You received that wound, Vren said, during the engagement at Keller's Rock. Day 9, she said. Northeast corridor of the processing facility. There was a breach at the secondary access point. Vren found the relevant entry in the file. Day 9. Northeast corridor breach. Attending physician report. Lateral cranial trauma. Unconscious on transport. Surgical intervention commenced within 40 minutes of injury. Prognosis non-survivable. Prognosis revised to critical at hour 6. Revised to stable at hour 18. The revision from non-survivable to stable in 18 hours had not triggered any particular note in the medical officer's report, which Vren found, in retrospect, a remarkable omission. He had read the medical officer's report twice. The second time he had read it, he had paid close attention to the language the physician used in the hour 6 revision. The phrase, "Patient displays recovery indicators inconsistent with initial wound assessment." The hour 18 revision was more direct. It simply said, "Patient is ambulatory. Patient is asking about corridor status." The officer had not elaborated on what it meant that a person with a non-survivable wound classification had become ambulatory in 18 hours and was asking about corridor status. The compliance forms did not have a field for that. "You were returned to active duty on day 11, Vren said. "Day 10, she said. The surgeon wanted 11. The breach at secondary access had moved to primary access by day 10, and we were short 3 people. She did not say this as a complaint or a boast. She said it the way a person describes a scheduling constraint. The surgery had wanted 11. The corridor had wanted 10. The corridor won. Vren looked at his data pad and then looked at her and decided not to say what he was thinking, which was that the physician who had written those revision notes had also, according to the file, requested early retirement from the Keller's Rock Medical posting approximately 3 weeks after the engagement concluded, and had cited in the request form a desire to pursue administrative work in a lower engagement system. The compliance chamber was very quiet. The ventilation hum had developed a secondary tone that Vren suspected was his own secondary auditory processing, adding detail to sound that was not actually there. He was aware, with a precision that his training had not given him vocabulary for, that he was sitting across a table from someone who had received a wound categorized as non-survivable and had returned to active duty 48 hours later and had then continued for 4 more days to hold a corridor. The numbers in the file were not disputed. None of the after-action documentation had been challenged by any of the 3 galactic observer stations that had independently verified the sensor data. There was no discrepancy between the filed record and the physical evidence, which was currently sitting across the table from him with a seam of white scar tissue along the left side of her face and her hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for the next bus on a transit line she had ridden 100 times. "Sergeant Vasquez," Vren said. He used her full designation without meaning to, the formal mode, and heard his own voice do it and could not account for why. "I want to ask you a question that falls slightly outside the standard audit parameters." "All right," she said. "The engagement outcome at Keller's Rock," he said. 43 personnel, 911 adversarial combatants, 4,000 non-combatant civilians, all of whom survived. 12 of your unit did not." He paused. The next part was the part he had been approaching since he first opened the file, the part that his supervisor had declined to be present for, the part that had made Tala put down her stylus and Pelk go through the full color spectrum of Kaldrathi distress signaling. 903 of the adversarial force did not. "How do you?" He stopped. He had the question. He was not entirely sure he had the framework to receive the answer. "How does a 43-person unit produce that outcome?" Nadia Vasquez was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering, in the way she had of considering things, which was the way a person considers a question they know the answer to but want to give fairly. "You know what humans used to do," she said, "before we had ships?" "I'm not certain I follow." "Before faster-than-light travel, before energy weapons, before translator implants and data pads, and galactic compact health compliance reviews." She said that last part without irony, or possibly with so much of it that it had gone fully around to something that sounded like sincerity. "We used to hunt. Not for sport. For survival. For most of our history, we were one of the smaller apex predators on a planet that had several larger ones. We learned to work in small groups. We learned to use terrain. We learned to go without sleep for longer than anything else in our local ecosystem, because staying alert when you're exhausted is a survival trait, and the things that couldn't do it didn't pass the trait along." She looked at him steadily. "Keller's Rock has corridors. It has choke points. 4,000 civilians who needed to stay alive gave us 11 different positions worth defending, and we knew which ones the Scraith would prioritize because we've been watching them fight for 3 years, and they have tactical preferences the same way every predator has tactical preferences." She paused. "And we were angry." Vren had not expected that last word. "Angry," he said. "There were children in the facility," she said. "Not combatants, not soldiers, families. Some of them had been in transit when the Scraith pushed into the system, and Keller's Rock was the closest place with a processing facility. They didn't choose to be there." Her voice had not changed register. It remained measured, clinical, the voice of someone filing a report. The content was something else. "We were asked, on day 3 by the senior observer from the Kaldrathi diplomatic mission, if we wanted to signal for extraction." Vren checked the file. Day 3. Signal for extraction. Request declined. Declination authorized by Sergeant First Class N. Vasquez, acting unit commander. He had read that entry. He had not fully registered what it meant until this moment, when he understood that she had been the ranking officer because the officer above her had been among the 12. "You declined," he said. "We declined," she said. "We had 4,000 people who couldn't extract. The Scraith had air superiority. Any extraction vehicle we called would have been destroyed before it reached the facility. We could have gotten ourselves out. We couldn't have gotten them out." She said it the way someone describes a calculation that has only one valid result. Not resignation, not heroism. Arithmetic. "So, we stayed." Tala made a sound. It was soft and involuntary, and in Raxian, it was a tonal combination that translated, Vren knew, to something like the recognition of a fact that changes the shape of everything adjacent to it. Tola looked embarrassed by the sound. Nadia Vasquez glanced at her, and her expression shifted briefly to something that was closer to warmth than anything Vren had seen on her face in the preceding 30 minutes. "It's all right," Nadia said to Tola directly. "I know what the file looks like." "What does it look like?" Tola said, and then stopped and looked at Vren, and Vren decided that junior compliance officers asking direct questions was not technically outside audit parameters. "It looks like something that shouldn't have worked," Nadia said. "I know. We know too." She turned back to Vren. "That's the part I think you actually want to ask about, not the numbers. You have the numbers. You want to know how we held the arithmetic in our heads and kept moving anyway." Vren found that he could not argue with that characterization. His secondary neural ganglion, which was supposed to be calibrating threat levels and filing them appropriately in his behavioral priority stack, had apparently decided that the woman across the table from him was not a threat in any category it had been built to process, and had therefore promoted the signal to a higher order processing tier. He was, in the vocabulary his species used for the experience, feeling something in the region between respect and the specific calibrated unease that Solvati experienced when standing at the edge of a significant drop. The understanding that the distance to the bottom is real, and that the organism at the edge is the kind of organism that could, if it chose, go over. "Yes," he said. "That is what I want to ask." She looked at the table for a moment. Not down, the way a person looks at a surface they are using to organize their thoughts, the way a tactician looks at a map. "You know what the hardest part of the human nervous system is," she said. And it was not quite a question. Not the pain tolerance, though that's part of it. Not the sleep deprivation capacity, though we use that too. The hardest part is that we have a response to threat that our evolutionary heritage specifically optimized for lost causes. She looked up at him. "When the outcome looks worst, when the numbers say you should stop, something in our biology says, keep going. We call it different things depending on the cultural context. Stubbornness, spite. Some of the old military traditions called it simply refusal. The mechanism is the same regardless of what you name it. The worse the situation looks, the harder the override kicks in." She paused. "Day 9, when I took the strike to the head, my last clear thought before I went under was that Corporal Reyes had the northeast corridor if I went down. That's not bravery. That's training layered on top of a biological drive that was old when our species was still using sharpened rocks." "We are not," she said, with a precision that Vren understood was deliberate and aimed, easy to stop. The room was quiet again. Vren became aware that Pelk had set down his datapad at some point in the preceding minutes and had not picked it up. The junior assessor was simply watching the human woman across the table with his chromatophores at a steady, pale gold. The way the Kaldrathi colored when they were receiving information they were going to carry for a long time. Vren understood that. He was going to carry this too. He already knew he was going to carry it. "The scar," he said again, and this time it came out differently. Less like an audit note and more like the thing it actually was. "My officers." The reaction. "They laughed," Nadia said. She said it without accusation. It was another flat report. "I heard them. In the corridor. Before you called me in. That's what they do when something surprises them, I think." The Kaldrathi chromatophore reflex triggered, and Assessor Pelk probably made a sound, and Assessor Tala covered it with laughter, because that's what young officials do when their bodies react before their professionalism catches up. She looked at Pelk. No offense. Pelk's chromatophores did something complicated that Vren translated as mortified agreement. "The thing about the scar," Nadia said, "is that the Scraith unit that left it is not in any after-action report. Because it wasn't in the after-action report. Because the after-action report accounts for confirmed kills, and the Scraith that hit me was confirmed as a kill before the medical team got to me." She did not say by whom. She did not need to. The implication was a door swinging open on a room that Vren was not sure he was prepared to walk into. "The reason it's notable isn't the injury. Plenty of soldiers get injuries." She touched the seam again, 2 fingers briefly. "It's notable because the species that leaves that scar has a kill record in formal galactic engagement logs of approximately 97% for any close contact strike it lands. The surviving 3% are in the Galactic Medical Archive. There are 19 of them, total, across all species who have engaged the Scraith in a formal military capacity, recorded in the 14 years since first contact." She lowered her hand. 8 of those 19 cases are Terran. I'm number 8. Vren heard Tala inhale. He heard Pelk's secondary vocal apparatus make a sound that did not resolve into any standard Kaldrathi word. He heard the ventilation system and his own secondary auditory processing contributing its phantom detail, and the blood analog of his own circulatory system in his ears, which happened when his threat calibration and his higher order processing were both trying to operate at maximum simultaneously, producing a kind of sensory interference he associated with the moments before significant decisions. 8, he said. Out of 19, she said, across all species, in 14 years. She was watching him with the steady, direct gaze she had had since she first directed her eyes at him and not past him. The other 7 Terrans, she said, are all currently on active duty. He did not ask what had happened to the other 11 because the arithmetic was available to him and he did not need her to supply it. The 11 represented 10 other species, none of them human, and the word that applied to them was in the file under a different category. He did ask, after a moment, a question he had not prepared. Do you know all of them? The other 7? Yes, she said. She said it simply, without elaboration, and the simplicity of it carried something that the clinical vocabulary of the compliance form was not going to be able to touch. Not pride. Something quieter than pride. The way a person says yes when asked if they know someone they have trusted with their life. And the trust was tested and held. Vren sat with that for a moment. The 7 of them, spread across 4 postings, carrying the same scar in different configurations, all on active duty, all in contact with each other across the distances that separated their assignments. He thought about the word association. He thought about what it would mean to belong to a group whose membership criterion was surviving a thing that was supposed to be unsurvivable. He thought about the fact that the membership had 8 people in it, and that 8 was a number the Galactic Medical Archive had apparently found worth noting separately from the other 11. The review, Vren said, and he had to find his way back to the official vocabulary, the way a navigator finds their heading after a correction, with conscious intention and a specific reference point. The reason this audit was flagged, Sergeant, was because the Solvathi statistical anomaly algorithm identified your deployment record as an outlier at a confidence interval we have, until now, only applied to equipment malfunctions. He looked at his data pad. He was looking at it because he needed to look at something that was not her face, and also because the data was there, verified, and looking at it was the honest thing to do. 7 deployments in 18 standard months. 4 involving direct Scraith contact. 0 civilian casualties in your area of responsibility across all 7. 0. He looked up. The algorithm flagged you because your outcome record does not fit any standard distribution model. It does not fit the model for highly trained military personnel. It does not fit the model for elite multi-species units with superior equipment. It is a statistical shape the Directorate has not encountered before, and our mandate requires us to identify the cause of anomalies. Nadia Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was the one she had worn when he first saw her, the navigator confirming a heading already chosen. What does the algorithm do? She said. Once it identifies the cause. It depends on the finding, Vren said. If the anomaly is caused by a procedural irregularity, we issue a compliance note. If it is caused by equipment performing outside rated parameters, we issue a maintenance flag. If it is caused by conditions not covered by existing category structures. He stopped. He looked at his data pad. He looked at Pelk, who was gold, and Tala, who had stopped even pretending to take notes. He looked back at the woman across the table at the scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, at her hands in her lap, loose and patient, at the way she sat in the chair that was not sized for her, as though the chair's original purpose had simply been revised. If it is caused by conditions not covered by existing category structures, he said again, the Directorate issues a request for category review to the Galactic Compact Standards Board. That sounds like it takes a long time, she said. It does. And while it's pending? Vren found that his mouth was slightly ahead of his formal reasoning. While it's pending, he said, the subject of the audit is released for return to duty, as the anomaly does not constitute a health compliance failure under any currently active standard. He paused. The pending category review does not restrict operational deployment. Good, Nadia Vasquez said. She said it quietly, without heat, the way someone says a word that ends a calculation they have been holding in their head. She unfolded her hands and placed them on the table, palms down, an entirely ordinary motion that nonetheless caused Pelk's chromatophores to flick briefly into a color Vren could not categorize at all, something between the gold they had been and a pale, uncertain green. She stood. The chair did not scrape. She had adjusted nothing about her posture throughout the entire proceeding, and she did not adjust anything now. She stood the way the compliance chamber's walls stood, simply already vertical, simply already occupying the space available. Is there anything else the Directorate needs from me today? Vren looked at his datapad. He looked at the 47 pages of file that had brought them to this room. He looked at the medical report with its non-survivable notation and its 18-hour revision to stable and its day 10 return to active duty. He looked at the after-action numbers from 7 deployments that had produced a statistical shape the Directorate's algorithm had never encountered. And at the category review request, he would be filing before the end of his shift, and at the space in the category request form where he would have to summarize, in the standardized vocabulary of the Solvathi Health Compliance Directorate, what he had found. He had been composing that summary in the back portion of his attention since approximately the point in the conversation where she had said, "We were angry," and he was aware that the summary was going to be the most difficult document he had written in 22 years of compliance work, because the form asked him to identify the nature of the anomaly, and he was going to have to find language for something the form had never been asked to contain. "No," he said. "You're cleared for return to duty, Sergeant Vasquez." She nodded. She picked up her transit card from the table, a small rectangular piece of standard issue laminate that she had set down at the beginning of the review, and that Vren had not consciously registered until this moment, when her picking it up made the table feel different. She moved toward the chamber door. At the threshold, she stopped, which was a thing she did not do in any of the 7 after-action reports, any of the 7 deployment records, any of the 12 debriefs in the file. The door was open. She stopped in it anyway. "The 19 of us," she said to the room, not to any of them specifically, or perhaps to all of them. "We don't have a formal association. We're spread across 4 different postings. But we know each other." She turned her head part way, enough that Vren could see the scar in profile, the full length of it, the raised white seam that the attending physician had once incorrectly judged to be incompatible with survival, and that existed in the face of that judgment as a simple fact, irrefutable, geometric. "The 18th is back on active duty as of last cycle. She's on the Valiant Storm far perimeter." She paused. "Scraith are active out there." The pause again. It had the quality of the compliance chamber's ventilation hum, unnoticed until it was gone. "I thought you should know." She left. The door closed. The ventilation hum returned to the level Vren had stopped hearing 2 years ago and was now hearing again. And this time, he did not expect it to recede. Pelk's chromatophores had settled into the pale, uncertain green he had produced when she stood. He had not, in Vren's experience, ever produced that specific color before. Vren did not know its name in formal Kaldrathi chromatic vocabulary. He suspected it was a color his species had developed recently. Tala had picked up her stylus. She had written 3 words that Vren could read from his angle. "They carry it." He did not ask her what she meant by it, because he knew what she meant by it, and because the compliance form waiting on his datapad was already going to take the rest of the day and most of the night, and asking questions he already knew the answer to was not a luxury he had earned. He pulled up the category review form. In the field marked Nature of Anomaly, he sat for a long time. The cursor blinked. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the station's transit network, Sergeant First Class Nadia Vasquez was walking back to her posting, carrying her transit card and the scar and 8 survival statistics that occupied a category the Directorate did not yet have a name for. In a standard month, the category review would reach the Standards Board. In 3 standard months, the board would convene a working group. In 6 standard months, the working group would issue a preliminary finding that there was insufficient data to define a new compliance category and would request additional documentation. Vren knew this because he had filed 11 category review requests in his career, and he knew how the process worked. He also knew with a precision that the process did not account for that by the time the working group issued its preliminary finding, Sergeant Vasquez would have 6 more deployments in her record, and the statistical shape would be the same one it was now, the same one the algorithm could not categorize because the algorithm was not built to model what she was. None of them were. He had spent 2 hours in a room with her, and he was not sure he could model it either. He typed into the Nature of Anomaly field. Subject demonstrates outcome distribution inconsistent with all existing performance models across all recorded species. Survival instances categorically inconsistent with wound severity documentation. Civilian protection record categorically inconsistent with adversarial numerical advantage. No identified procedural explanation. No identified equipment explanation. He stopped. He looked at what he had written. He added 1 more line at the bottom of the field in the clinical neutral vocabulary of the Solvati Health Compliance Directorate. He wrote, "The anomaly is the subject." He saved the form and set down his datapad. Pelk was still pale green. Tola was looking at the door where Nadia Vasquez was no longer standing. The ventilation system did what it always did. Vren sat with his datapad in his hands and did not, for the first time in 22 years of compliance work, feel that the form he had just filed was adequate to what it described. That feeling, he decided, was the correct one to have. 3 standard weeks later, a message arrived on Vren's secure Directorate comm terminal from an origin tag that resolved to Combat Advisory Post 7, Terran Station. It contained no text. It contained a single attached file, which was a copy of the Valiant Storm's latest deployment report, marked for general distribution to all compliance directorates under the Galactic Compact's transparency protocols. He had not asked for it. It had been sent to him anyway. He opened the deployment report. The Skryth active zone on the far perimeter had seen engagement over the preceding 10 standard days. The Valiant Storm had been in the zone. Its after-action documentation was 7 pages long. He turned to the final page, the summary, and found the casualty numbers and the civilian protection figures and the statistical shape that the compliance algorithm had already flagged once in a different room on a different form 3 weeks ago. And that apparently intended to go on being exactly what it was, regardless of whether the standards board had developed a vocabulary for it. He sat with the report on his screen for a while. Through the sealed viewport of his office, the docking arm of Terran Station extended into the dark in a long, functional line, lit at intervals by proximity markers, and somewhere beyond the markers, in the direction of the far perimeter, the Valiant storm was doing what it had been doing, and the numbers were what they were, and the algorithm had no category for any of it. Vren closed the report. He did not file a follow-up. He held the pale green feeling that Pelk had colored, and the 3 words Tola had written, and the last thing Nadia Vasquez had said before she walked through the door and into whatever came next, and he held all of it the way his species held difficult calculations. Carefully, in the part of the mind that does not let go of things that matter, for as long as it takes to understand them.